Okay, so I want to talk to you about techniques for painting fur, tips for painting fur in watercolor wildlife. Speaking of fur, here is something with a lot of it, but she's missing some at the moment. So leave a comment. Brave girl Rhodey, she reads all your comments on my videos. She's had 2 back-to-back knee surgeries and she's very brave. So let's jump in. The way that I paint my wildlife portraits in watercolor is realistic, but not hyper realistic. I want them to still look like they were painted with watercolor. This has been an ongoing battle with myself for a long time because I do tend to just put too much detail in, but that's my goal. So bear that in mind when I run you through these tips. The first one being try to suggest fur without necessarily painting all of it. I think that's one of the things when you are a beginner at watercolor wildlife is that you feel compelled to paint every little piece of hair, every feather, every bit of fur. And the reality is we don't need to do that to still make something look realistic. So this little goat here is a good example of how I've utilized a couple of things. The first one though being that suggestion of fur. So on the fur itself, you don't actually see fur strokes. There's not a single fur stroke painted within this brown fur. What I've done is selectively choose some areas to flick fur out from, making sure to follow the growth pattern of the fur on the animal. So make sure you take a good look at the reference photo to see which way the hair is growing and pointing out. And I've done that by sort of flicking some fur into the white, and that in turn negatively paints some in there, which is a tip we'll talk about later, but also flicking some out to the side as well. I've utilized a couple other things we'll talk about later as well, which is scumbling around here and also just some blooms. This one here, although it's one of my favorite portraits, it's a little bit overkill in terms of like detail that I don't always want to be doing in my portraits. There's a lot of flicking of fur out. And as you can see, you can either do a lot or do a little and still achieve the look of, you know, a furry, realistic looking animal. Then this panda brings me to a tip I want to give you about this tip, which is when you are utilizing this technique, it can be kind of tricky, right? Look at this. Can you see just around the tip of that ear, there's actually a line going through there. That is actually from my pencil line. It took me so long to figure out why this was happening to my portraits. I don't know why, I couldn't figure out that it was the pencil doing it. But what can also do this is a layer underneath it. So whenever you're utilizing a technique like this that's involving flicking out a lot of fur, you want to be careful. You don't want to just slop it on at the end, you know, do a layer, a nice big round ear, and then go and do another layer, flicking all this fur out, because you will get a bit of a crust showing through. So try your best where you can to put in the depth of color that you need in that first initial layer, or be prepared to go over it. That can be challenging in and of itself, but that's my best tip to avoiding those lines. You can see down here as well, they're just dried at different speeds there, and there's a bit of a line going on. So that's what you got to be cautious of too. These little lines that you're flicking out to the side, there's a lot more surface area around them, a lot more edges in which the drying can start versus this big patch that you'll have nice and damp. So these can all start drying faster and give you that crusty edge. Something that really caught me off guard when doing this portrait as well, which is something to keep in mind, is see how this side looks here, just quite nice, and I've negatively painted in the white. This one, to me, I can see like on these sides, very clear curves here. So I really struggled because I started it too late. I started to realize too late in cutting in fur. You don't want to leave all the edges on this side blunt. You want to try and bring it in and create this soft edge instead of having this big square line and then jutting them in. So I find by just starting further out, that helps, instead of like what I did here, which was basically paint all my color in there, then go back and start flicking them in. It was kind of too late. I've already created this really obvious circular shape. So just start your negative painting a little bit further out when you're flicking in like that. And similar with here, you know, don't take the color all the way to the edge and then start flicking out from there. Give yourself a bit of room and start the flicking out earlier than the edge, and that'll just make it look more natural. Another example here that is also going to combine another one and move us into the next tip. So we've got some little suggestions of fur here and there with some black, with some gray in the white, but also here, blooms. Can you see these areas here that are much lighter? Now I didn't use a different color in here, but I did drop excess water in here with my brush, load it up with water and drop it in. And what that does is expel the paint outwards from where you're dropping it. Now, if you do this on a super duper wet layer, it's just going to blend in, you won't really see it. It needs to sort of be done at this tipping point, and it needs to have this sheen over the page, but not like sopping wet. And you also don't want it super dry as well, unless you're trying to create a really obvious bloom like here. You see those rough edges that are started right at the top of the head of that goat. It's the same technique here, but this is just much softer. So my next little tip is about utilizing wet in wet. Wet in wet is a watercolor technique when the page is either wet with water or color, and then you drop more color or water into it. And it just creates this beautiful, soft, flowy effect. So you can see here, I've dropped water in this area. I've also dropped different colors in as well. And it just really creates this lovely floaty airiness in your work. You can do it one of two ways. This is in a controlled boundary. I am dropping in color and it can't really escape. But you can also use it the opposite way and have just water all around and then drop your color in. And that looks a little like this. So this little bear here, I have wet the whole page down to start my initial layer, and you always want to do your wet on wet first. It just makes it so much easier. If you have to go back and do wet on wet, you risk disrupting all of this work that you've done before. So I've wet down the page and dropped my color in and let that kind of flow around. Now that, when you're doing it without a boundary, it can kind of get a bit wild. And you can see here, it's sort of migrated down alongside my tape and made a little bit of a brown line there. Do you know how I combat that? I just cut it off. I just guillotine it. Problem solved. I never made a mistake. What are you talking about? But this is a really fun technique for those really fluffy, soft animals. It does require a bit of control, and I often find myself sort of bringing it back in with my brush. This one, though, I didn't. You can still see it's quite organic there versus one I'll show you in a second. So instead, what you want to do is just really keep an eye on that sheen. Make sure your page is not flooded with water, that as soon as you drop it down, it's going to explode everywhere. You really want it to just softly be blending out. I always talk about a brush as being like a leaf blower or a vacuum cleaner when we're talking about an exchange of water and watercolor. When there is more moisture on the page than on the brush, it's going to act like a vacuum cleaner and suck it up. But when there is more moisture on the brush than on the page, it's just going to expel everywhere like a leaf blower. If you can manage both of them, that there's like a moderate amount of water on the page and a moderate amount of water on the brush, it ends up being a much smoother, fairer exchange. And it just means your color doesn't go everywhere and you can still maintain shape. Here is one that I had to fight relentlessly with. This British Shorthair cat, I wet the whole thing down and it just kind of went everywhere. And you can kind of see here and here that it's a bit messy and a bit dark, and obviously it traveled up the side as well. And I was just constantly bringing it back with a brush. You can see the area here. Those are very much brush bristles, dragging that color back in. Another way that we can paint fur is actually by not painting the fur at all, by negative painting. Now, negative painting isn't when you get in a bad mood and then you start painting. What it is painting around something. So similar to what I was talking about in the earlier ones where we're suggesting fur and I was dragging the strokes in, this is just a bigger example of that. So I had this little light colored guinea pig around the top and I wanted this dramatic dark background around it. So instead of painting white fur, which is, you know, how do you do that when your background's white, right? We can just negatively paint it in. So I did a much better job on this one than with the panda at keeping a really natural shape. You know, it doesn't look like this big round blob around its head. I've really been able to make these look like organic fur strokes, I think. But I would say it doesn't make it any easier than using, you know, a technique where the water can run everywhere. It's quite hard to manage all these edges and a background at the same time. So don't stress yourself out if you're having trouble with this the first time. You can see here as well that there's just like little random bits of fur that aren't actually connected to the guinea pig that I've still left in there because I think it looks quite fun. If this is quite a dark background, it could just be the light catching this part of the fur stroke, but not here. It just makes it a little bit more fun and loose. So this is a particularly great technique if you've got a light colored animal, light fur, and you're trying to find a way to paint a background. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as this, a really dark background, but this technique is a very easy way to paint white without needing paint at all. Next we have salt and blooms. So I love salt. I love sprinkling salt on. We saw what some blooms can look like earlier, but popping salt on gives you a similar effect, but it's a bit more random. It does depend how you kind of put it on though, because it can look a little bit like a pattern. So you don't want to just like, you know, be placing granules on exact distances apart from each other. I like just sprinkling it on, a little bit of a vintage Salt Bae action, or just use a grinder and just let it kind of flick all over the place. Again though, just like blooms, you really want to get the timing right. So we really want to have that sheen on the paper, nothing sopping wet or it's not going to do anything. And if it's too dry, it also won't do anything. So you might want to experiment with how many minutes is the best amount to place some salt down. But please bear in mind, if you're going to do an experiment like that and time yourself, keep in mind that the climate that you paint in when you do that might be different from the climate that you paint in when you actually paint the portrait. So I wouldn't use that as a hard and fast rule. That's why I always say just look for the sheen of the paper. Make sure there's still a bit of a sheen on there, but it's not visibly sopping. And then we have dry brushing and scumbling. So this here is a big example of just like a lot of detail. And don't get me wrong, I love this portrait, but this is way too many brush strokes and I would normally want to be doing in a wildlife portrait. Plus, I went out of control and totally misshaped his head up here and had to try and fix it. But this involves just having a dry brush, so you load it up with color, and what I do is dab the excess moisture off on paper towel before I go into my portrait. And then you just start brushing away, and what you actually get is this lovely texture of the paper. The bristles kind of skip over some of the areas. Instead of with a wet brush, it would just kind of coat the whole thing smoothly, and it leaves us with this beautiful rough texture. And scumbling, if you've never heard of it before, this isn't specifically just for this portrait. I've probably done it in every single one I've just shown you, but that's when you rub the belly of your brush around and you just kind of catch some of the paper as well. So it's a dry brushing technique, and I love doing it to darken areas without having to go in with a whole nother wet layer. So for example, on this fox, I would have scumbled around the eyes to create some shadow there, and you can really see some scumbling come to life on this bear as I went in just to deepen a few little areas. This here, the scumbling on the bear, I would say is moister than what I would normally use, but what I find is that technique, using more water in your scumbling, in your brush, it works really well on 300 GSM paper, but not lighter. So normally I would paint on 185 GSM, but this one was painted on 300 and it works really well. So keep that in mind if you're someone that switches between paper weight, because I find that scumbling works a lot better on lighter paper when you've got a really dry brush. You can see some texture just there as well up there. But if you happen to have some 300 GSM, some thicker paper, I find that scumbling looks awesome when you have a little bit more moisture on your brush. So there you go. We've got suggestions of fur using flicks and blooms, wet in wet, either controlled or free, negative painting, salt and blooms, and dry brushing and scumbling. I hope these tips for painting fur in watercolor were helpful, and I'll see you next time.